Would the senator from Maryland yield for a question?
I will.
I found it very interesting that you pointed out that these tax provisions for the middle class, no tax on tips, is phased out, and no tax on overtime is phased out. And what you're saying, I believe, is that when they put into this bill that a tax break is ending, they're saying that it doesn't cost any more in the following years.
So they are certainly saying that their current policy baseline that they want us to make believe about would say that this wouldn't cost them. In other words, if they extended this, it wouldn't cost anything. It is interesting to note, not only does that expose the fraud behind the current policy baseline, but they made a very deliberate choice. Even though they now say that they can make these tax cuts permanent and still comply with the rules, they decided to make the tax cuts for very rich people permanent. But even though they say it's not going to cost anything anymore to provide, tax cuts with no tax on tips, they're phasing those out. And all of these areas are where President Trump made promises that he was going to take care of some working people. Well, man, those go away fast. Tax cuts for the rich, they go on for not just the full 10 years, but they keep going, which is why this is a violation of the entire reconciliation process.
So I find two things very interesting. They're saying if something was in the law that they passed in 2017 and it expires, they're pretending it doesn't expire and therefore extending doesn't cost anything. But in their own bill, when they say a provision expires, they're saying, no, it really does die, and therefore we're saving money in the years after. How is those two things possibly consistent?
Well, clearly they're not. I mean, this is literally magical thinking. This is why Republican Congressman Schweihart called this, or Chip Roy called this fairy dust, and why the congressman from Arizona said this was pure intellectual and economic fraud. That's what it is. That's the bottom line.
Well, I really thank the senator from Maryland also pointing out that President Trump, he did, when he was campaigning, say he was fighting for ordinary families. But at his inauguration, who did he have standing behind him? Not champions for health care or champions for housing, certainly not champions for nutrition or education, but in fact a series of like 5 or 6 billionaires. And now you're telling me that in this bill, and I want to make sure the American people understand this, the provisions that were sweeteners to say we were helping working people are being phased out, but they're keeping all the tax breaks for billionaires.
Well, you're right. It was right down this hall, actually, that President Trump was sworn in, and he said it was going to be a new golden age for working people. Well, as you're pointing out, and this chart clearly shows, and their own budget reveals, it's clearly a golden age for billionaires and people who make a lot of money. And in this bill, they make sure that that golden age for very rich people goes on forever. They had a few little crumbs that they were throwing for a little while, we can see, to others, but just for a little while and just small amounts compared to the golden age for the billionaires.
Well, I must say my impression is, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Republicans are embarrassed by the fact that they're proposing a bill that creates over $3 trillion in debt in 10 years and over $30 trillion over 30 years, and that the vast bulk of it goes to billionaires. And so they want to say, we're so embarrassed because we mentioned fiscal responsibility when we were running for office. We were going to get the budget under control, and they're doing the opposite. And they're embarrassed that they're doing these cuts in programs to fund tax breaks for billionaires, cutting regular health care, 16 million people losing health care for tax breaks for billionaires that, as you point out, go on and on and on, actually permanent. I would certainly love to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island.
When I was budget chairman and we were trying to focus, for instance, on the impending economic nightmare coming our way through climate-caused property insurance failures, what I would get is nonstop regular lectures from Republicans on the Budget Committee about how we had to take responsibility for the deficit, we had to reduce the debt, nothing else mattered as much, it was absolutely vital. And now, of course, we see that at their very first shot, with the power to do anything through their majority and using reconciliation, they're raising the debt. They're raising the deficit, and not by little, but by trillions. And I'm wondering if in your time as chairman, or perhaps in Senator Murray's time on the committee, or perhaps in Senator Van Hollen's time over on the House committee, you were favored with such constant lecturing by Republicans about the debt and the deficit, and how credible that all seems right now.
I'll yield to Senator Murray.
I thank the senator for his question, because it's just stunning to me that the vast majority of debate, in fact, all the debate that came from Republicans at the time I was chair of the Budget Committee trying to put forward a smart budget for the United States of America, the only thing they talked about was debt and deficit. The only challenge they made to us was debt and deficit. The only time we tried to do anything for childcare, for healthcare, they threw the debt at us. So it is pretty stunning to me that now that they need to raise the debt for giving tax breaks to the very rich people who stood behind the president at his inauguration, then they play with the numbers and pretend it's not real, and a trillion all of a sudden becomes zero, and I'm using some rule you've never heard of to try and pretend that this isn't real. It's fairy dust.
I just want to say, to answer the question from the senator from Rhode Island and pick up on what my colleagues have said, that when I was the senior Democrat, the ranking member on the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan was the chairman of the committee. And look, we disagreed on many things. We agreed on many things. We both agreed that we should get our deficits and debt under control. We had different ideas on how to do it. He wanted to privatize Medicare. We wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But we wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But the reality is that the holy grail, I mean, the only guiding North Star for Republicans at that time was we've got to bring down deficits and debt. This is not that Republican Party, not in any way, shape, or form. They clearly don't give a damn. In fact, they are worried, as we can see, that the American people still care, which is why they want to engage in this fraudulent scheme. But I'll just close on this. I remember one of those years, I believe it was the 2012 Republican convention. They even put up a debt clock. They put up a debt clock at the convention.
I can't find it.
Right? I'm looking under my desk for the debt clock here because Republicans seem to have hidden it away forever. They want to wish it away. That's what they're telling us.
But the bill actually is required to raise the debt limit by $5 trillion. So in reality, there's a huge hit to our debt, huge additions to our deficit, and it makes me a little bit frustrated to think back to all those lectures that I had to receive as budget chairman, which the senator from Maryland witnessed as a longtime member of the Senate Budget Committee, which the ranking member witnessed in his time on the Budget Committee, and which Senator Murray experienced when she chaired the Budget Committee. We have been lectured to death by our colleagues, and at the very first instance when they had the power to do something about it, they went 180 the other direction and are cranking the national debt in order to give big benefits to the rich people who fund their campaigns.
For a question, and I know we need to move on here. I just want to add one thing. It's not just that it's going to be debt. It's the cost to families because this debt they are putting in place. I would ask the chair of the Budget Committee now, as he knows as I do, people's houses are going to cost more because their mortgage interest rates are going to go up. Their cars' interest rates are going to go up. This is not just magic numbers sitting out there pretending they're not. Real families are going to feel the cost of this debt and this deficit.
I really appreciate that point from my colleague from Washington State, because in this bill, it creates so much necessitated borrowing that CBO estimates that that borrowing will cause interest rates to go up. And when interest rates go up for the Treasury, it goes up on your car loan, on your adjustable rate mortgage on your house, and just in general. These are costs that are borne by ordinary families. And I find it very interesting because the Republicans were demanding what they called the dynamic score, saying, well, won't these cuts produce such a great economy that it will kind of lift all boats and produce more revenue, and maybe the deficit won't be as bad. Here's what Congressional Budget Office found. Again, that's the nonpartisan, honest broker numbers. They found that because of the interest rates rising as a result of this massive sea of red ink that necessitates massive borrowing, that in fact those rising interest rates will hurt the economy. So there's no dynamic score that produces, oh, well, it isn't so bad after all. No, it's the opposite. And in fact, that dynamic argument has always been wrong. And we are looking at the folks who lectured, my colleague from Rhode Island, and I sat through many of those lectures as well. And I went, in my head, wait a minute, aren't these folks who did the massive ocean of red ink in the 2001 Bush tax bill? Aren't these the same folks that produced a massive ocean of ink in another tax bill 2 years later? Aren't the same ones that in 2017 did a massive ocean of red ink, and now they're doing it again? How could they possibly be putting themselves forward as deficit hawks or debt hawks? Not to mention that they cheered on two adventures that were a huge tragedy for the United States of America, trying to occupy Afghanistan and going to war in Iraq, which together added $8 trillion to our debt. And if you take a look at this chart, every time there is a Republican administration, the last deficit while they're in office compared to their first deficit goes up. For Clinton, it went down. That's fiscal responsibility. For George W. Bush, first term, it went up. For Obama, it went down. In other words, the Democratic presidents, time after time after time, Clinton, Obama, Biden, they reduced the deficits while they were in office. And the Republican presidents, while they were in office, every single time increased the deficits. So none of us want to hear any more talk about fiscal responsibility from across the aisle. You want to be fiscally responsible? Vote no on this bill, because this bill takes and fires 16 million people off of health care to finance those tax breaks for billionaires. This bill says 4 million children will go hungry to finance tax breaks for billionaires. This bill is families lose and billionaires win, and the debt goes up, endangering our ability to do basic programs for the entire next generation. It is wrong on every count. And I think collectively, we urge our colleagues to honor the argument they've made over time that, in fact, they were concerned about the deficit. They were concerned about American families. Because if you are concerned about the deficit and debt, if you are concerned about families, you must vote no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.